Don't let them take my daughters. That whisper pulled Silas from his saddle in the Wyoming blizzard of 1877. At a fence post, a nun bound in barbed wire, blood frozen to her skin. Beneath her, 3 newborn girls curled in the snow. Above them, the storm howled. Below them, men on horseback were closing in. Want the rest of the story? Drop a 1 and come sit by the fire. And if this moment gripped you like this video, and subscribe, so you'll be here for the next tale. Now saddle up, settle in close to the fire, and let me take you back to a winter in the Wyoming territory, where a blizzard was howling through the Snow-Horn Mountains. And one man's ride home turned into a meeting that would change 4 lives forever. Wyoming territory, January of 1877. The wind off the Snow-Horn Mountains was howling that evening, not in the way a man can ignore, but like some wounded beast that meant to take the skin right off your bones. Snow came sideways, biting hard at the eyes, filling every hollow, every crack in the land. Silas Granger knew the sound of winter storms. He'd been listening to them for near half his life. But what he heard just then wasn't the wind. It was higher, sharper. He reined in his gelding, leaning his head to the side. The sound came again, thin, desperate, and multiplied. 3 of them, maybe. It was the kind of crying that wasn't going to last long in cold like this. He swung down from the saddle boots, sinking to the ankle in snow crust. The trail under him hadn't seen a hoofprint in days. It cut through the pines like an old scar, leading toward a sagging fence post, half buried in white. That's where he saw her. She was still upright, but only just arms wrenched behind her, lashed to the post with barbed wire. A black veil hung in frozen tatters from her head, her habit torn and stiff with ice. Her cheeks were pale as fresh snow, except where bruises bloomed dark and cruel. Around her feet in the drift lay 3 small bundles, no bigger than rabbits, swaddled in what looked like the shredded lining of her robe. One of them whimpered. The other 2 didn't make a sound. Silas moved in fast, kneeling beside her. The barbed wire had bitten deep into her forearms, leaving the steel rusted with her blood. He took out the knife he kept in his boot and cut her loose. She swayed as the last strand gave way, and he caught her around the waist. She was light, too light, and limp as a grain sack left in the rain. Her lips cracked open. "Don't let them take my daughters." The words were no more than a breath, but they carried the weight of a plea he couldn't ignore. "You're coming with me," Silas said, his voice low, steady. He gathered the 3 infants first, tucking the smallest inside his coat, and wrapping the others in a wool blanket from the saddle. Then he lifted her into his arms, holding her close so his body could give what little warmth he had to spare. The wind knifed across the clearing, but he set his jaw and started back toward the trail. The climb home was half a mile uphill through snow that would take the strength out of most men, but he didn't slow. There'd be time for questions later, time to find out who she was, what devils had left her to die. For now, there was only one thing that mattered. She wouldn't die out here, not on his land. If this beginning has you leaning in, give it a like so I know you're still riding with me, and subscribe so we can keep sharing these trails together. Now let's step inside the storm and see how it all began. By the time Silas reached the cabin, the storm had worked its way into every seam of his coat. The fire inside had long since gone out the air, heavy and cold. He kicked the door open with his shoulder, carrying her straight to the bed of quilts in the corner. The babies came next, set in a deep basket lined with rabbit pelts. He didn't stop moving. The fire was the first thing. Kindling pine splits, and the match he always kept dry in a tin. Soon the hearth snapped and hissed, orange light reaching into the shadows. He hung his soaked coat by the flames and peeled off his gloves, his hands raw and cracked from the cold. The woman hadn't stirred. Her habit was torn at the hem, stiff with frost, the veil still clinging to strands of hair frozen against her cheek. He could see now the lines of her face fine, but drawn tight by exhaustion and pain. From a jug behind the stacked wood, he poured goat's milk into an iron pot and set it near the fire to warm. He found a small spoon carved from pine, the one he used when feeding orphan pups in spring. It would do just fine for the little ones. Before the milk was ready, He brought a pail of warm water to the bed. Sitting beside her, he wrung out a cloth and began to clean the dried blood from her ankles and calves. The bruises were deep, ugly purple against her pale skin. Someone had kicked her, and more than once. He worked gently, dipping the cloth, wiping, covering her again with the quilt. She didn't wake. Her breathing was shallow but steady now. The smallest baby started to cry, a thin, reedy sound. Silas crouched by the basket, testing the milk on the back of his hand before offering the first sip. The little mouth opened clumsily, then took the spoon greedily. The others followed, each fed in turn, each tucked snug under the blanket again. It was only when he looked back toward the bed that he saw her eyes half open. They were a startling gray, clear, even through the weariness. She blinked at him for a long moment before her lips parted. "My name is Sister Maribel," she said, voice barely more than a whisper. "Silas," he answered, plain as always. Her gaze drifted to the basket, to the 3 small forms bathed in firelight. Her eyes filled, but no sound came. Just a silent stream of tears tracking down her cheeks. Silas rose across the room and fetched the elk-hide cloak from his trunk. He folded it and slipped it under the babies so they'd be warmer. When he looked up, Sister Maribel was watching. He didn't say a word, just gave her a slow nod before turning back to tend the fire. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside, for the first time since he'd found her, the cold was losing its hold. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe so we can ride more trails together. Comment the moment that stayed with you. And drop a 1 if you're ready for the next ride. Some storms don't come with snow, some ride in on horseback. It was 3 days after Silas had found Sister Maribel when the knock came not at the door, but on the frame of his mind. A quiet warning he felt in his bones before he ever heard the hoofbeats. The morning had been still, the mountains wrapped in the kind of calm that makes a man uneasy. Silas had gone out to split wood, the swing of his axe measured and steady. Inside, Sister Maribel was humming to the girls, a low, soft sound that seemed to smooth the air itself. That was when Hattie rode up the trail. Her green wool shawl was pulled tight, her cheeks flushed from the climb. She didn't dismount right away, just looked at Silas with that no-nonsense gaze of hers. "It's about her," Hattie said, nodding toward the cabin. "Joseph Quinn's put out word. Says the sisters run off in some fit that she's not right in the head. He's telling folks those babies are his by law, and that she's keeping them hidden." Maribel had stepped into the doorway, the smallest girl in her arms. Her eyes widened, but she said nothing. "He's hired men," Hattie went on. "4 of 'em. Says they're coming to bring her back where she belongs. But the way they ride." She shook her head. "That ain't no rescue party." Silas didn't ask questions. He didn't waste words. He just took the pouch Hattie offered, jerky dried beans, a flask of spirits, and gave her a single nod. When she left, the mountain seemed to close in around them. That day, Silas worked without pause. He reinforced the cabin door with an extra crossbar, moved supplies to the root cellar in case they needed to vanish quick, stacked the firewood high so Maribel wouldn't have to step outside. He checked the rifle, then the hunting knife, sharpening until its edge caught the firelight like silver. Maribel fed the girls and kept them close, her face calm but her hands never still. Once she tried to speak, tried to tell him he didn't have to put himself in the middle of her fight, but the words fell away under his steady, unblinking gaze. By sundown, the snow had started again, light at first. The cabin smelled of stew and pine smoke. You wouldn't know by looking that danger was climbing the mountain, but Silas knew. He'd seen men like Joseph's before, men who believed they could claim people the way they claimed land or cattle. That night, they both slept light. Every creak of timber, every groan of wind was measured, weighed. The girls lay warm between them, breathing slow, unaware. Just before dawn, the sound came. Hooves on frozen ground. 4 sets, slow, deliberate. Silas rose, took one last look at the fire, then reached for the door. The storm outside hadn't yet shown its teeth, but it would. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe so we can ride more trails together. Comment the moment that stayed with you, and drop a 1 if you're ready for the next ride. Some bonds aren't forged in words. They're built in the quiet when no one's looking. After Hattie's warning, the days settled into a strange sort of stillness, like the hush before a fresh snowfall. The riders hadn't come yet, but their shadow was there, stretching long over the cabin. Sister Maribel moved with quiet purpose now. Her steps no longer faltered the way they had that first night. She rose early, tending to the fire before dawn, checking the girls one by one. Silas often returned from his traps to find her standing at the window, the light of the snowfields on her face. A child in her arms, the other two asleep in their cradle of rabbit pelts. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He wasn't the kind to push a person for their thoughts. Still, he noticed the small things, the way she hummed a hymn under her breath, when the wind rose, the way her hands lingered on each child, as if counting them again and again, making sure they were still there. One afternoon, he was outside at the workbench, sleeves rolled, working a thin plank of cedar with his carving knife. Maribel came to the doorway, the babies asleep inside. She didn't speak, only watched. Silas didn't look up, but he knew she was there. The air shifted when she stepped into it. His knife worked steady, shaving curls of cedar that drifted to the snow at his feet. That evening, when she laid the girls down, she saw what he'd made. 3 small wooden plaques, each no longer than her hand, hung above the cradle. Each bore a name carved neat and true: Eloise Ruth June. The wood had been oiled until it caught the firelight. She touched them gently, as if afraid they might fade. No one, not even in her old life, had ever carved her daughter's names into anything lasting. Now here they were, given a place above their heads, like a blessing. In the evenings, she began to sing. Not just to the children, but to the room itself, soft lullabies from her childhood hymns she'd once sung in the chapel's candlelight. Silas would sit by the door, long frame leaned against the jamb, sharpening a tool or mending a strap, saying nothing but always listening. One night, while stirring a pot of stew, she said his name, not just Silas, but the full weight of it: Silas Granger. He turned slowly, meeting her eyes. "I never said thank you, not properly." "You didn't need to," he said. It was the longest silence they'd shared without it feeling like a gulf. Something unspoken passed between them, steady and certain. She smiled, just a small curve, not the kind that says everything is fixed, but the kind that says something has begun. Outside, the wind shifted. Snow whispered against the walls. Inside, the quiet felt less like waiting for danger and more like the start of trust. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe so we can ride more trails together. Comment the moment that stayed with you and drop a 1 if you're ready for the next ride. Some storms you can smell before they hit. This one carried the scent of snow and trouble. The wind began its climb in the late afternoon, rattling the shutters like impatient hands. By dusk, the mountains were wrapped in a white fury, snow slashing sideways, erasing the world beyond the porch. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed its light, painting the rough-hewn walls in flickers of gold. Silas moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, checking the shutters, setting the crossbar on the door, glancing once at the rifle by the hearth. Sister Maribel sat near the fire. Ruth and June bundled close against her. Eloise slept soundly in the cradle, unaware of the tightening in the room. Then Silas froze. He stepped to the front window, brushed away a thin crust of frost with his knuckle, and leaned close. Shapes emerged from the blizzard, 3 riders pushing against the wind cloaks, drawn tight, heads bent low. They moved slow, deliberate, like men who believed the mountain owed them passage. "It's them," he said. Maribel's breath caught. She didn't need to ask who. "Take the girls. Follow the creek. Stay low. Don't stop. Don't come back unless it's with the law." His voice was firm, but not loud, like iron under a blanket. Her mouth opened, but before she could speak, he was already moving. He pulled the elk-hide cloak from its peg and wrapped it around her shoulders. Into her satchel, he tucked jerky dried apples and a small flask. Then he pressed a short-bladed knife into her palm. Keep it close. If they catch up, don't hesitate. What about you? She whispered. I'll lead them the other way. He bent to kiss the crown of Eloise's head, quick and silent, then guided Maribel to the back door. She gathered the girls, two in her arms, one strapped to her back, and vanished into the storm. Silas turned back to his work. He dragged a spare coat onto a broom handle and planted it near the southern trail. Lit an oil lamp, set it low behind a log to cast moving shadows. Half a mile down, he tied his horse to a tree as if it had been abandoned in haste, then lit a small fire just around the bend. Enough to confuse, enough to draw eyes. The knock came minutes later, hard without welcome. Silas opened the door to find Joseph Quinn standing on the porch, snow plastered to his coat and hat. His eyes were cold as river ice. She took what's mine, Joseph said. The girls carry my name. You came this far for a lie, Silas asked. I came for blood. Joseph's hand dropped to the pistol at his belt. Silas didn't move. She belongs to herself. One of Joseph's men swung the butt of his rifle. The blow caught Silas on the shoulder, driving him to one knee. Snow seeped into his shirt, crimson blooming across the seam. Drop it. The voice came from behind Joseph, firm, carrying the weight of authority. Sheriff Mather rode out of the storm lantern high, two deputies at his side. Behind them, Sister Maribel emerged from the trees, her cloak torn, snow clinging to her hair, but her eyes bright with resolve. Tell them what you did, she said to Joseph, or I will. Joseph froze. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Arrest him. The deputies pulled Joseph and his men from their saddles, cuffing them without ceremony. Maribel was already at Silas's side, pressing her hand to his shoulder. You're not dying, she said. He gave her a ragged grin. Wasn't planning on it. Spring came slow to the Snowhorn Mountains, but it came. The snow pulled back from the ridge, giving way to patches of green moss and the first stubborn violets. The air carried pine on its breath again, mingled with the faint, sweet scent of bread baking in the hearth. Silas's shoulder healed in time, though the scar would stay. Sister Maribel tended to it each day, with steady hands, never speaking much about the night of the storm. They didn't need to. Together, they rebuilt the cabin. The east wall was pushed out for a larger hearth. Maribel painted the shutters a soft green with pigment Hattie brought from town. Before long, travelers began stopping in fur traders, ranch hands, timber haulers, drawn by word of a hot stew and a safe bed just below the second switchback. They called it the Hearth at Granger Ridge. Life settled into a rhythm. Silas hunted chopped wood, kept the stables. Maribel cooked, taught local children their letters, sang to the girls in the evenings. Eloise learned to walk. Ruth said her first word, and little June began to hum before she could speak. One evening, after the last guest had gone and the girls were asleep, they sat together on the porch steps. The sun slipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and lavender. Below them, the land stretched wide and quiet. Maribel's hand found his. This fire between us, she said softly. It never went out. Silas looked toward the horizon, the corners of his eyes crinkling. It just needed a place to live. They sat like that until the first stars came, watching the mountains keep their peace. Two people who had weathered the worst of winters and built something that would last. In the heart of the Wyoming wilderness, Silas and Sister Maribel's journey reminds us that God's greatest works are often done through ordinary hands. This is a story of courage, sacrifice, and the quiet strength to protect the innocent, even when the cost is high. It tells us that no soul belongs to cruelty, and no life is beyond the reach of mercy. In the bitterest winter, love can still take root because God's light shines brightest in the coldest places. He calls us to stand for what is right, to shield the vulnerable, and to choose compassion over fear. When we shelter others, we are sheltering Christ himself, who said, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me." The message is clear. Faith is not only spoken, it is lived in the daily choice to love without condition. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, so you'll be here for the next one. I've got another Wild West tale waiting for you.